So it's really wonderful to be with you this morning. My name is Benjamin Carter. I'm the vicar of two parishes, formerly known as the Benefice of Haydonbridge and Beltington with Henschel, but we call them the parishes by the wall because if you know the north of England and if you know Hadrian's Wall, they take in all the best bits of Hadrian's Wall. So Housesteads and Vindelander, Sycamore Gap, High Shield Crags and all those bits there, as well as two decent-sized villages in the Tyne Valley and quite a lot else beside that. But I've been asked to come and chat to you this morning from what we call the parishes by the wall to talk about God's tent, which is a new way of being church that we've been exploring in the parishes by the wall over the last few years. And so it seems fitting, as we're gathered in God's tent, we are in the tent this morning, to begin with the prayer that we always begin our pitchings of God's tent with. So when God led Moses through the wilderness, God pitched his tent among us. And when God made David his great king, God pitched his tent among us. And when God came to be with us in Jesus, God pitched his tent among us. And here, in Haydonbridge, but also everywhere you are today as we gather on Messy Church Live, God pitches his tent among us. So what is God's tent? Well, God's tent is a new way of being church, exploring God in creation. And I always like to try and start talking about God's tent by talking a little bit about how we got here. And the way I do that is I talk about the story from the book of Acts, from Acts 8 of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, because in a funny way, the shape of that story helps tell something of the shape of how we ended up pitching a 6-metre bell tent in the wilds of Northumberland week after week, month after month over the last 3 years or so, as we've been exploring this idea of God's tent. And the first part of that story is that Philip is called by the Spirit to go out and proclaim the gospel. Now, I wouldn't be as bold as to say that we had a word from the Spirit to tell us to begin with God's tent, but there was a sense in which we were responding to what we were hearing all around us. As I've already said, I'm the vicar of these wonderful parishes in the Tyne Valley, but I'm also and fortunate to have some wonderful buildings to work with. But those buildings are quite restricted in many ways that our beautiful old buildings are. These are parishes of St Cuthbert, and so these are places where the community of Cuthbert rested with Cuthbert's body as they made their brave and perilous journey from Lindisfarne eventually to Durham all those centuries ago. But because the buildings are at the moment quite inflexible, it meant that as we were encountering more and more children in our worship, which was a wonderful thing, and more families who were wanting to find out about the life of our church, particularly actually through engagement with our local Messy church, we were finding that the things we wanted to do more of and develop, we couldn't do in our church buildings, particularly for some of the slightly older children, and by that I mean in the sort of 8 to 10 bracket, perhaps 7 to 10 bracket. We were discovering that the things you might ordinarily do with them, gathering them for activities or a youth club or perhaps, you know, a table tennis club or those sort of old-fashioned but wonderfully traditional things you could do, we just couldn't do in our buildings. Added to that, when we were trying to do stuff in one of our church buildings, we could only do it in the vestry. However, the vestry has a organ jutting halfway into it. It's not really a separate room, but just an extension with the organ sitting across it. So when our Sunday school would meet in their Storybook Church, as soon as the organ started to play, Storybook Church would have to pause for a moment. And at times, if Storybook Church was getting rather excitable during their worship, which is a wonderful thing to happen, it would rather spill out into the life of the church and the worship we were doing. So we were struggling with the buildings that we had and the spaces we had to know what to do. And the other thing is that, as somebody once pointed out to me, I must be one of the very few vicars to be vicar of parishes which include an area of outstanding natural beauty, a national park and a World Heritage Site, with the North Pennines in the south edge of the parishes and Northumberland National Park in the north, and the Hadrian's Wall World Heritage Site, as I say, running across the top edge of both parishes in the benefice. And we say all the time that the church should get out of its buildings and get out and about, but I'm not sure we always necessarily know how to do that, certainly in a pre-COVID world. But what we realised was actually there was a wonderful opportunity for us to start exploring who we could be as a church community in that beautiful creation. And the thing that brought those three bits together, how to engage better with younger families, how to have a more flexible space, and how to get out into nature, got solved by one thing, by our wonderful tent. Because the thing about the tent is it's quite a lot of fun. It's incredibly flexible. We can put it up and take it around most places we want to go to. I was going to talk a little bit about the practicalities later, but also the tent allows us just to get to all these wonderful places and engage with people in lots of new and creative ways. So quite quickly we decided we would begin this new activity, really thinking about offering something for older children and their families if they wanted to engage with us. But then we come to the next part of the story of Philip and the eunuch, which is the part of the story that most of us remember, which is that wonderfully slightly comical scene where he finds himself on the roadside and sees this chariot going past and realises it's the person in the chariot that he needs to speak to. And the way he has to do that is he has to start running to catch up with the chariot. And what we discovered with God's tent was that quite quickly this became an idea and an inspiration for us that was moving much more quickly than perhaps we'd expected. Often in movements where you can perceive the Spirit at work, often the Spirit is encouraging us to move more quickly and more assiduously than perhaps we might have expected otherwise. That happened in a few ways. The first was really that God's tent very quickly became something which wasn't specifically focused on older children, but actually something that was available for whole families to engage with together. They're safely inside at the moment so as not to distract me while I'm doing this, but we're lucky to have two wonderful daughters who are 6 and 4 who love being part of the God's Tent community. Equally, we've got adults and parents who are obviously much older than 6 and 4 who get a great deal out of how we worship together in God's tent. And the other thing about moving more quickly is that if you work in a rural context, as I do here, that can seem slightly counterintuitive. It certainly sometimes seems counterintuitive in the Church of England, where we like our processes and we like to stop and ponder and think and muse and ponder and think, and then have 16 subcommittees to ponder and muse and think as well. And actually in rural contexts there's a view that somehow we slow our heart rates down and we move at the slower and more stately pace of rural life, and there is some truth in that. However, in rural contexts and small contexts, often we have to move more quickly than we would expect. We had an opportunity, particularly with the young families we were engaging with, that if we didn't engage with them in the next 6 months or so, as I perceived it about 3 years ago, they would evaporate away into other activities and other forms of community. And so we had to move very quickly to engage with them. So God's tent very quickly became something which was a fully formed expression of church in its own right, not just this thing we did over there. And within a year of God's tent, we baptised new believers in the Tyne, so we pitched the tent by the river and had a baptism in the river, and they then moved into formal confirmation within the life of the church. And we work very hard to make sure that what we do in God's tent works in complete sympathy with our inherited models and patterns of church here in the parishes by the wall. And that focus on tradition takes us to the next part of the story of Philip and the eunuch, because when Philip encounters the eunuch and he eventually catches up with the chariot, he encounters the eunuch reading from the book of Isaiah. And actually it's Philip recognising the tradition that the eunuch was coming from, that this man was coming from, and saying, let me tell you about that tradition, let me tell you about that truth fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. And it's really important for us as we work through God's tent that we're always working with the grain of the tradition that we've inherited. I'll talk again a little bit about that as we talk about the kind of pitchings that we do. But we're very careful to make sure that what we do is about engaging with the deep stories of creation, the deep stories received and revealed to us in Scripture, but also the deep stories of Christian faith and the patterns and experiences of Christian faith as we've received them through the spiritual wisdom of the world around us. And then the final part of the story is perhaps the most mystifying, is that point at the end of the story after Philip has baptized this man. He is then spirited away by the Spirit and jumped, I think, about 9 miles away or so. Now, that hasn't yet happened to one of the leaders of God's tent. But what we've discovered is part of the task of God's tent is to create a space and to create a place in which people can gather with one another and with God. And then part of our task as the leaders is actually to get out of the way. Particularly in a pre-COVID world, family life was very busy, very cluttered, very full of stuff, and even families who would regularly meet on a Sunday morning in church often would hurry from that to the next thing. There is something slightly timeless about the tent. There is perhaps a slightly kind of Enid Blyton shtick about it, or the glamping feel, but there is a sense in which the tent is a time out of time, and so when we pitch, just for that hour, families are invited just to be with each other and be with the other people who've gathered in the tent. And so the conversation is created, and then they continue that conversation themselves. And some of the most exciting things we've heard is when we've heard that families have carried on that conversation in the car on the drive home, or at home when they've finished. That actually what we're doing is creating a space in which those conversations and places can happen for people. Perhaps as we restore our world after this COVID interruption, we might refine something of that in our daily lives, and that space and pause that some of us have been blessed to find through this period of lockdown. But we think we perhaps spotted some of that possibility a little earlier than this pandemic in our pitchings of God's tent. So that is how we began pitching God's tent just over about 3 years ago here in the parishes by the wall. And as we pitch each month, it's taken us a little while to think about how best to tell the stories that we're encountering. And the way we do that is that we focus very deeply on a Bible story at the heart of what we do and how we meet God in that place. There are lots of books about finding God in creation, and they're wonderful books and wonderful resources, but many of them talk about creation being the second book of Revelation, and that is of course true, and you can't be helped but be wondered by the glory of creation if you live somewhere like I'm very fortunate to live here. But I'm very keen and very important to stress that for me the first book of Revelation is the Bible, and therefore we start with a Bible story, and often it's a Bible story that we're encountering in our inherited worship at that time, or through the seasonality of the year that we are part of. And then we think, well, how can we explore that story in creation? And the way that we find to explore that story in creation is often by taking a pattern of spirituality or faith from the wider Christian tradition and using that to help us relate with creation all around us. So a good way of talking about this is how we talk about parables and Jesus' parables, wonderful, complex, nuanced and nutty stories that Jesus gives us to understand our faith. And one of them is the story of the wise and foolish builders. And the way that we've explored that in God's tent is we've gathered people in the tent, and then I've read the story of the wise and foolish builders, or one of the leaders has read the story of the wise and foolish builders. And then we say, well, the thing about being a wise and foolish builder is you can think about it, but the most important thing is to go and do it. And then we go into some woods where we've pitched near, and we build dens in groups and have lots of fun for about 45 minutes or so, building our dens. And once we've built the dens and gone and looked at each other's dens and marvelled at all the stuff that we've done, we then come back into the tent and I read the story again. And I say, well, if we're a wise or foolish builder, what made us wise builders of our tents? And people will say, well, we worked together, or we thought carefully about the space that we created, or we made sure that we were protected from the elements, or we made sure there was space for everybody. All those things that you would do if you were building a really, really good den. And then I stopped, and then we would read the story again, and say, well, if you were building your life like that, how would you build your life if you were making space for other people? and you were working with other people, and you were creating a place of hospitality and protect you from what the world might throw at you. And then we reflected on that thought as well. Because what we've done is we've done, in a very loose sense, a Lectio Divina, that wonderful pattern of spiritual reading that we find in the Benedictine tradition, a way of using creation to mediate that Bible story, but structured with the tradition that we found. So sometimes that works very smoothly, sometimes we have to sort of work a little bit, but it's a way of ensuring that we're always relating our experience of God through Scripture with our experience of God in creation, and holding those in relationship to each other. Perhaps I might just I'll try to answer what I think are a few sort of straightforward practical questions that people always ask me about God's tent. So what is God's tent? Well, God's tent is a 6-metre bell tent. It lives in the garage at the vicarage, and it does cost a little bit of money to get established. The tent and all the stuff that we've used for our ministry through God's tent probably cost us about £1,000, which is no small amount of money, and we were very, very aware of that. And we were very lucky in these parishes to have a little bit of money in mission funds that we were able to use for that. I would say, though, that that investment has paid itself back, I wouldn't say 100-fold, but certainly countless times, partly in the ministry of God's tent itself, but also because this becomes a wonderful space in and through which we can engage with the wider community. I often describe the tent as like a giant dog collar. If you work in a parish like I work here, if I walk down to the Co-op after finishing this Facebook Live to get a pint of milk, I will probably have 3 pastoral conversations on the way back and forth, because they see the dog collar and people just engage with me in that way. And people now start to associate the tent, and as we set it up with God's tent, as the ministry of the church in that place. And that means that obviously that's through church events. We use it for storytelling and engaging with the wider community, but also at school, not just church school events, but wider school events, wider community events. We'll pitch the tent and be present as the church in that place. So it's a wonderful investment and a fantastic space to use, whatever your context or whatever the place you might be. It is not hugely cumbersome. It's quite heavy, I won't deny that, but to fit people, I'm 42 and I can put this up with one other person in about 20 minutes. So it goes up and down very easily, and it's not the kind of thing that takes hours and hours to prepare for. Very often God's tent, we meet at 3, we gather for the pitching at 3, so we'll gather at 2, and I'm normally home with a cup of tea and a hot buttered crumpet by about 5 o'clock. So it's not a hugely cumbersome thing in that way. It is a canvas tent, and that's part of its beauty in terms of the space, but that does mean that if it gets a bit wet, it can be tricky to dry. So thinking about how and where to dry it is a really important thing. A few people have commented about how lucky I am to work in the context I am, and I must admit I try not to sound too smug about it, but I am hugely lucky to work in the context I am. And some people have asked whether or not God's tent is something which is specifically or exclusively for a rural context, and it's something that absolutely has grown out of the soil of this place. I can't deny that. It is something that has grown out of this place. But it's important to recognise that the spaces we need to pitch God's tent aren't exclusively available in rural contexts. There was some research done a few years ago where people were drilling down into the figure about how much of this country is covered in concrete, and people complain about how much of the world around us is getting concreted over. And if you look at how much of this country is rural to urban, it's about 90% of the landmass of England. Great Britain is rural, and about 10% is urban. And then if you look at that 10% of the space, actually if you drill down into that urban space, how much of that urban space is actually concreted over, because people have gardens and there are parks and there are little bits of wasteland here or there that people use. And of the whole landmass of Great Britain, only 2.27% is actually covered in concrete. So that means that nearly 97% of Great Britain you could put God's tent on. And I would be very encouraging of people to think about how They might use God's tent in all kinds of different contexts, because this is something that has grown out of a rural context and we've learnt about in a rural context, but I don't think it's something which is exclusively available to people who work in a rural context. So if this is something that's excited you or inspired you, and you don't work in an exclusively rural context, that's not a reason not to think about it and not to do that. One of the other great joys of God's tent is that it's a very flexible space, and it's flexible both in terms of where we use it and how we put it up, but also it's flexible in how we engage with one another. One of the great strengths of the Church of England, I often think, is that we work across the sort of blurred boundaries of church and world all the time, and that's something that we sort of instinctively do. And one of the things that God's tent allows us to do is for the church to be present in what we might describe as secular spaces. I've talked about using God's tent at school fetes or other contexts. But also it's allowed us to create spaces for reflection and time in schools. One of the challenges that schools have is not just time, but space, particularly in very small rural schools. And one of the things that we've been doing, although very sadly has been delayed a little bit by the COVID interruption, has been to try and develop a regular ministry of spaces for prayer and reflection in our local church schools on a sort of rolling, perhaps half-termly basis, going around those schools. And what we are able to do with the tent is not just to provide the resources and the content, but also literally the space to do that in. And if you talk to a hard-bitten and stretched head teacher, somebody coming in and not only creating the resource but also the space for that is a hugely welcome thing. And one of the areas we're looking to develop God's tent within the Diocese of Newcastle, where I am here, is working with the Board of Education, who've invested in 2 more bell tents. And again, before we had the pandemic interruption, the intention was to start rolling out God's tent into church and school contexts. So churches locally would start pitching God's tent as a regular pattern of their worship, and as part of that would be serving their local schools, both church and state and county schools or local authority schools in those contexts as well. That's very much something we're talking about as well. Yeah, they just picked up on that question from Fiona about God's gazebo. Yeah, I must admit, we love God's tent. It's a wonderful space, but we always have a plan B, particularly when the wind starts to blow. So sometimes, I must admit, God has popped up his gazebo amongst us as well. And just because we're using a bell tent doesn't mean that you need to use a bell tent. You can use all kinds of materials and things which are really a really good way to do that. As much God's tent for me is as much about the idea and the aesthetic as it is about the physicality of the tent. This has worked perfectly for us and has been a really wonderful way of doing it. I've got a colleague who works on the Northumberland coast. Pitching a tent on a beach just doesn't work, but she's beginning to think about how she might develop an idea of God's tent in that context. Paul's asking about pupil numbers. So for God's tent, in terms of the space we have here, I think the most we've ever had in the tent was probably about 25 for a pitching itself. That's adults and children. And when we've been engaging with the schools, we're normally thinking about class sizes as a sort of engagement. So when we've structured it for a day with the school, we've often brought in a class at a time. Now, obviously, for very small rural schools, those are often mixed age group classes, almost always mixed age group classes, but sort of 20 to 30 would work very well. And if you look on the website, which I think has been shared, there's a video of how we've done some work on that. We're just coming towards the end of this half hour, which has raced by, which has been really wonderful. And I just wanted to reflect a little bit about what God's tent is for me. God's tent is many things, but God's tent is God's tent is about Jesus, which sounds like a really obvious thing, because surely the church should always be about Jesus, but you would be surprised how often you find that the church isn't always about Jesus. And it's about Jesus because of the way we do our worship and how we reflect in things, but also God's tent is about Jesus because of the tent. Most of you will have been bored at midnight mass by a preacher reminding you that when John in the prologue to John uses the word skenou for lived among us, it was a pun on the word skene, meaning tent, because when God came to be with Jesus, God pitched his tent among us, reflecting back to that image of the tent of meeting from the story of the Exodus. But it's a really important image of who God is for us. At the beginning of the lockdown, and people were getting very anxious about church buildings and whether or not we could go into church buildings, I, in a rather intemperate moment, tweeted out, "We are living in a wilderness, and in the wilderness God calls us to worship in tents and not temples." And there is some great wisdom about what it is to worship in a tent and how we find and encounter God in the context of a tent. And in that sense, it's a different way of being church. God's tent is small. Mike Cleveland has just asked how we fit into our tent. It's about 25 at best. If we had more than that, that would be wonderful, but it would be something different. Actually, small is hardwired into the experience of what it is to worship in the rural church. It's actually hardwired into the experience of what it is to worship in most of our churches, in most of our contexts. Jesus says you need 2 or 3 people. That's absolutely fine by me as long as we're salt and light. And therefore, being in a context and a pattern of church which is small by its very nature is for me really important. It's also fragile. I don't know how well the microphone is picking this up, but if I just stop speaking, you might just be able to hear the rain pattering down on the tent outside us and the river roam behind us. And God's tent is fragile. If you worship in a tent on a hillside in Northumberland when the wind is blowing and you've only got the width of the canvas between you and that, you know what fragility is. And actually sometimes we need to be better at leaning into, at rejoicing in the fact that God gives us fragile communities to work with. Goodness me, we've seen that through this pandemic, but the great strength and resilience of those fragile communities and what it is to worship in a space that is fragile. There is also something about the tent which is sort of now and not yet as well. One of the things I love doing when we put up God's tent for the first time for worship is that often what falls out of the tent is the memory of what we did last time, the leaves from the trees from the place we were before, or something like that. And then we worship, and then we pack away, and as we pack away, we're thinking about the next time we're going to be there. There's always a sense in which we're pushing forward. And that goes back to that wonderful image of the tent pitching God, and those puns on skene and skenou, because actually one of the other parts of that language in the prologue to John is also that the word skene was also used, skenou was used by the writer of that prologue as a pun also on the Hebrew word Shekinah, for the glory of the Lord. That actually, when we find God pitched among us in Jesus, we see the glory of the glory of God's glory in the Son. So as we pitch the tent, we're always looking ahead and forwards towards the greater glory that God is revealing for us. So I am absolutely pushing up against my half hour, and so I will be rerunning this, probably saying many of the same things, but I'll go through some of the questions, and if people have got questions they want to add through the day, I'll try to make sure that at 8 o'clock this evening, or British summertime, I'll add that. I'm going to do a absolutely gratuitous plug, which is there is a book about God's tent, which is now available to buy. It's published by Sacristy Press, and you can get it through their website. It's also available on Amazon to buy and as an ebook. And if you really wanted to do well, you would go to your local independent bookshop and ask them to order it for you as instead. So in there it says many of the things I've been talking about today, and a reflection not just on the theology of what we've been doing, but the imagery, but also some sample pitchings. So if you wanted to do God's tent and think about it, that would be a wonderful place to start. But as my half hour comes to a close, I'm going to finish, as I started, with a prayer, but finish with the prayer that we use as we finish our worship in God's tent. So may God the Father be with us as we leave his tent. And may God the Son be with us and guide us as we return to our homes. And may God the Holy Spirit guard us and keep us as we travel through life, till we gather again in God's tent pitched among us. Amen.